This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about Donald Trump, and in particular, why I, as a libertarian, cannot support him. I have a lot that I want to say about this topic, and I've been discussing it on a bunch of other shows lately, and I've had a couple of really good back and forths with other libertarians that have a different perspective than me. So I want to make the case, the libertarian case against Donald Trump on the show today. I do want to say as a caveat before we begin the episode that I have no animosity towards libertarians that are voting for Trump as the lesser of the two evils because they believe that a second Trump term will be preferable to a second Harris term. I understand the calculation. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. This is not meant to be hateful or spiteful towards libertarians or conservatives that want to support Donald Trump, but I am giving you my thoughts on why I personally cannot support Donald Trump. Now, I am recording this on Tuesday, October the 1st, and this episode isn't going to be released for 2 weeks. So I'm probably going to talk about some political circumstances on the show that could have changed. One of the things that I have been saying all throughout this campaign cycle when I have guests on my show to talk about politics is that I pre-record all of these episodes, and we have to take into consideration the fact that the entire presidential election could be dramatically different 2 weeks down the road from now. So there might be some things that I reference in this episode that are no longer major factors. Like I said, it's Tuesday, August the 1st at 3:18 p.m. as I'm recording this, and I just saw on antiwar.com that Iran launched missiles at Israel, and I know that the unions that run the shipping companies at the major ports in the United States have gone on strike. Both of these things could have a dramatic impact on the direction of the election. And like I said before, there have been 2 assassination attempts against Donald Trump, and the Democrats picked a presidential candidate by circumventing the primary process. They literally cooed Joe Biden and picked a candidate of their choice, Kamala Harris. So I am not under the illusion that these are not the last changes. There's no guarantee that when we go to vote in November that these 2 candidates will be the 2 candidates that are on the ballot. I understand that. And I really do believe as I'm looking into October that this is probably going to be a really, really, really bad month in American history, because I think people's emotions are just so heightened and so that people are just so furious and so scared and so upset about what's going on. And so I understand that things could change and the reality might be different. But as of today, it's Trump versus Harris. And I guess Chase Oliver's in there too. And we're going to talk about him a little bit in a few minutes. It's Trump versus Harris. And this looks like the way that the election will go. But I don't know for sure. We can't possibly know for sure. One of the things that I find really frustrating about this entire conversation from a libertarian perspective is that I sincerely don't believe that this election is going to change anything. 2016 was really interesting because a true outsider won the presidential election for the first time in my lifetime, especially for the first time in post-World War II history. And that represented something. And Trump ran as a populist. He said that he was going to drain the swamp. He said that he was going to limit the scope of government. And the reality is nothing changed. In fact, everything pretty much got worse. I think that a lot of the perceived economic benefits that people felt during the Trump administration were not due to his tax cuts that weren't offset by spending cuts. And we're going to talk about this in a minute too, because that's a really important component of this and the Trump tariffs and all of those things. I think a lot of it is that the Fed has just been building a massive economic bubble that would have popped at some point, even had COVID not happened. COVID just made that bubble pop a little bit earlier than expected. So there is really no justification for the idea that Trump is going to make America great again, because he didn't do it the first time around when he had an opportunity to do so. Now, I know that there are a lot of libertarians out there that think that Trump is smarter and wiser than he was before, that he really learned his lesson the first time around, but I'm just not convinced. So I don't believe that this election is actually going to change anything. I think that regardless of who wins, we are going to get more war. We're going to get more spending. We're going to get more debt. We're going to get more government. None of the problems that are facing our country, none of the problems that libertarians understand derail civilizations are actually going to be addressed, regardless of whether Trump or Harris wins the election. I just don't think it's going to make a difference. Now, the first point I want to make about this is that I do think that Trump is marginally better than Kamala Harris. I do think that a Trump administration will do less damage to the American economy and to the American society in general than a Harris administration. I had it wasn't really a debate, but it was a back and forth on the LCI Green Room with Dave Casey, great podcaster, really good guy, and he plans on voting for Donald Trump in this election because he's dissatisfied with Chase Oliver and he thinks that Trump is a better shot. Let me tell you right now that I have nothing but respect for people like that have very intelligent reasons for wanting to vote for Donald Trump and understand, like Dave did, that Trump is only marginally better than Kamala Harris, that Trump isn't going to be our hero. He's not going to rescue us. He's not a libertarian, but we might actually move the needle in the right direction if Trump wins the election. I understand why libertarians would support Trump for that reason. Like, I understand why they would vote for Trump for that reason. That makes perfect sense to me. And there are a lot of libertarians that I follow on Twitter and that I've met in real life that are going to be voting for Donald Trump. And they're doing it not because they love Donald Trump and not because they support him emotionally, but because they think that he's going to be marginally better than Kamala. I mean, again, it's interesting that on that green room conversation, we did not have somebody making the libertarian case for Kamala Harris because there is none. It's either Trump or Oliver or not voting at all. And those are really only the three options that a good, consistent libertarian can make. And again, I appreciate and respect all of these libertarians that I feel like are voting for Trump because they think that it might be marginally better. But I sincerely don't think that it's going to make a difference. And as a Christian, I genuinely don't believe that it actually makes a difference who is in charge of the American empire. The problem is empire in general, not who runs the American empire. And if Donald Trump prevents the American empire from growing even a little bit, even at a slower rate than Kamala Harris would, then I think that that's a good win. But I just can't get behind somebody that grows the American empire. And ultimately, as a Christian, my hope is in Jesus. That's it. And I believe what the gospel says, that Jesus is the Messiah, that he died for our sins, that he was raised from the dead, and that he sits at the right hand of the Father. And I believe the book of Revelation, I believe Revelation 1, 4, and 5, and then Revelation chapters 4 and 5, where Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father, and that because Jesus ascended into heaven, he is now Lord over all creation, and that we are a part, like we, the family of Abraham, those that have put our faith in him, are building God's kingdom on earth, and that in reality, true power lies in the hands of the church, and it's not the government's responsibility to do the church's job. And in fact, usually human political authorities are the antithesis of the work of the church. And I think that any time that the church has tried to co-opt human authority or try to rule based on the way that human civilizations are run, then the church has always compromised its mission and it's always failed. As Christians, we are the true people of God. We are the true kingdom of God. We worship the true king, and it's our job to build the kingdom here on earth. That's our role. That's our responsibility. And there are Christians all over the world, in places like Nigeria, where my friend Econ Bro lives, in places like China, in places like Russia, where it is actually in many places dangerous to be a Christian. It's not easy to be a Christian in those environments. And I know that there are a lot of Christians that are panicking that it's going to be the end of our Christian comfort in America if Kamala Harris wins. But you know what? One, I don't think that that's true. And number two, would that necessarily be a bad thing if American Christians actually had to fight for their faith instead of being comfortable? Trust me, I really want to live in a society where everyone's individual rights are respected, where we have the freedom of religion, where we have free and open dialogue and the freedom of association and the free press and all of the freedoms that we value. I think that over the last 10,000 years of human civilization, about 5,000 years since human beings have been living in cities en masse, I think that we've learned a couple of lessons, and I think that basically the Enlightenment thinkers got it right. Big authoritarian governments do not work, and we have to figure out how to limit the problem of human power. Unfortunately, it's a lesson that the vast majority of people living in the Western world have forgotten today. And there are historical reasons for that we've covered on the show. But ultimately, if we believe that Jesus is king, and that it's our responsibility as a church to build the kingdom of God, and that the only real nation, the family of Abraham, is, transnational based on boundary lines that were created in the 18th and 19th century, then we have to understand that who wins an American election is more or less irrelevant, because the day after the election, the mission of the church is the exact same as it's been for 2,000 years. And that's never going to change no matter how bad things get in America. I just don't put my hope in the political process, and I don't think that we're ever going to see a real change in this country until people's hearts are changed. That has to come from the inside first. And there are just not a lot of people that are willing to accept the fact that we cannot make a positive impact by taking control of the reins of the political power of the American imperial government. We just can't do that. And that's not something that's realistic. And that's not something that as Christians we should be striving for. So my hope is not in the political process, but I want to talk today about why, as a Christian, even though I believe that Donald Trump is marginally better than Kamala Harris, I just can't support him, both as a libertarian and as a Christian. Now, I do think that it's very important that we make a difference here between supporting a political candidate and voting for a political candidate. Many of the libertarians that I know that are voting for Donald Trump don't actually support him as an individual. Dave Casey was a great example of that. Dave Casey acknowledged all of Donald Trump's failures and all of his flaws, all of his character deficits. He was very honest about that. So he's not a Trump supporter, but he is going to vote for him because he thinks that sends, and he lives in Delaware, which is a deep blue state. So I live in Kentucky, which is a deep red state. The really ironic aspect of the debate between the two of us was that our votes don't actually matter. Anyways, he votes for Trump in Delaware. Delaware's still going to go to Harris. I vote for Chase Oliver in Kentucky. My votes still, or our electoral college votes are still going to go towards Donald Trump. That's just the way that this works. So I understand why someone would vote for Donald Trump, because they either want to send a signal to the establishment that they want someone who's at least perceived as an outsider. They are frustrated with the Libertarian Party drama and with the way that the party convention turned out, or that they just believe that Trump might be better than Kamala Harris on the margins. And so I understand why libertarians would vote for him for those reasons. And to be fair, Trump did come to the Libertarian National Convention. The chair of the LNC, Angela McArdle, has a working relationship with Trump and Trump's administration. He said he's going to free Ross Ulbricht. He said he's going to put a libertarian in the cabinet. So Donald Trump has made some overtures in our direction that I think are pretty good. Donald Trump has also talked about wanting to find a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine, which I think is a libertarian positive. A potential Harris administration will only continue the Biden policy of perpetually funding Ukraine so that they can conscript 17-year-old girls to go and fight Russian men for democracy, or whatever they say that form of conscripted slavery is. And so, yeah, I mean, I get that. Trump has made some really great promises to libertarians, and there are some really interesting people from a freedom perspective, like RFK, like Tulsi Gabbard, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who have some very good policy positions on some very important issues. And it does seem like Donald Trump is surrounding himself with better people this time around. Okay, let's hope that that is the case. And those could all be reasons why a libertarian would legitimately vote for Donald Trump. But that's not the same as supporting him. That's not the same as being a Trump supporter that is ride or die Donald Trump, no matter how hypocritical or double-minded or contradictory his policy positions might happen to be, no matter how much Trump's rhetoric diverges from his actual policies that he put into place. Those Trump supporters, ride or die Trump supporters, do not care about public policy. They only care about what Trump represents, which, again, Trump represents a giant middle finger to the establishment. And I understand that. But the problem is that every single libertarian knows that Trump was an establishment president. Trump did not break precedent from the previous administrations. He just continued to carry on the terrible policies of the Bush and Obama administrations that helped dig this country deeper and deeper into the hole that we find ourselves today. So Trump supporters are in this impossible position where they can't actually justify any of the policy positions that Trump made. They really just like him for the aesthetics. And I know very few libertarians that support Donald Trump. I know a lot that are voting for him, but very few that support him. And I think that distinction is a whole lot different. It's very important to remember that. So again, as we're listening to this, don't feel like if you are going to go and vote for Trump that I am critical of that decision. I think you should be informed. I think you should have good reasons for doing it. As long as you don't think that Donald Trump is our libertarian hero, then we are fine. Again, we're going to get to the details in a minute. I have one more side point that I want to make, but the reality of the situation is that Trump promised to drain the swamp in 2016, and the swamp only got bigger. He didn't drain the swamp. He only made it bigger. And so when Trump says that it's going to be different this time around and he's going to make America great again, you have to forgive me for not being able to believe him because he didn't do it right the first time. And he's too easily influenced by the terrible people that he surrounds himself with. So I do hope, because again, as a libertarian, I would prefer, I'm not rooting for him, but I would prefer a Trump victory over a Harris victory. I really would. And I hope that in 2 years, all of these libertarians that I said, were like, maybe you shouldn't be giving Trump your vote. I will go, I promise you, in 2 years, if Trump gets elected and he winds up actually turning this country around and he finds a way to lower, to take care of some of the debt, to lower the deficits, to reduce military spending, to get some great people in his cabinet, and to overall lower the size of government, I will go on a giant apology tour and say I was wrong. That is exactly what I would love to see. But he didn't do it the first time around, and so I don't believe him the second time around. Now, all of this to say is that I am very privileged because I live in the state of Kentucky, which is not a swing state. As I said before, it does not matter who I vote for. All 8 of Kentucky's electoral college votes are going to Donald Trump, and there's nothing that I or any libertarian can do to stop that from happening. Trump is a lock in the state of Kentucky. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, Alex, it's really easy for you to not vote for Donald Trump and to vote for Chase Oliver because your vote doesn't matter. And you would be correct. If you live in a swing state, I completely understand why you would vote for Donald Trump. Not support him, but vote for him. I completely understand why you would throw him your vote, especially in these swing states where the margins of error are so thin. If you're a libertarian, you understand realistically Chase Oliver's not going to win the election. Even if he was the greatest libertarian, even if we'd had Dave Smith, the libertarian candidate is not going to win the presidential election this time around or next time around. Hopefully in 8 years, maybe. That would be cool. But we know that the libertarian candidate is not going to win this time around. And if you're in a swing state, it would make sense to vote for the candidate that you think would make this country marginally better than the alternative. So I totally understand that. I don't think, though, that if I lived in a swing state as a Christian, I could vote for Donald Trump. I don't think I could do it. And here's the reason why. Donald Trump, in terms of economic policy, is a socialist. Again, I'm using the Misesian definition of a socialist, which is anyone who believes in any sort of government control or regulation of the economy. Chapter 15 of Human Action, if you look at like the first 2 or 3 passages of that chapter, Ludwig von Mises talks about how there's no such thing as a mixed economy. You either have free market capitalism or you have socialism, and there is no in between. You only have socialism by degrees. And I agree with Ludwig von Mises on that. And if we are going to judge Trump's economic record based on the Austrian School of Economics, Trump is a socialist, and he's also a war criminal. And we cannot forget that he is those two things. And so this election is coming down to 2 socialists and 2 war criminals, one of whom happens to be marginally better than the other one. And as a Christian, I find socialism to be a grave moral evil because I don't believe in theft. And I also find war criminals and war crimes in general to be grave moral evils. And as Christians, I just can't support those at all. I can't do it. Like, I cannot support a socialist and a war criminal. And so even if I was in a swing state, I don't think that I would be able to give my vote for Donald Trump. But of course, if I grew up in a swing state and that was just kind of all we knew, I don't know, maybe there's a situation in which I could be convinced to vote for Trump if I lived in a swing state like that. But I just don't see that happening. And let me explain to you why. There are a lot of progressive Christians out there that are incredibly politically hypocritical. I mean, I think the political consequences of progressive Christianity are inherently unchristian. And I think that there's always a lot of hypocrisy and double standards among the progressive Christians when they begin talking about politics. But there have been some very, very blatant double standards. And I want to talk about those a little bit. So I usually don't name drop and get into some drama, but I've had public exchanges with both of the figures that I'm going to talk about. And I think that it's important for you to understand where they're coming from and why I, as a Christian, do not want to be just a right-wing version of these left-wing progressive Christians. And before I even mention the political conflict I have with them, I have nothing... I'm a very traditional Christian. I had an episode of my podcast about that a month or two ago by the time this comes out, where I talked about how I'm a traditionalist. And so I'm not a progressive Christian in terms of theology. I know a lot of theologically progressive Christians. They're very good people. Those conversations I think are always very interesting. When I say progressive Christians, what I mean are Christians that vote for progressive candidates. Now, they're almost always theologically progressive as well, and they use their progressive theology as a justification to vote for progressive political candidates. But being a theologically progressive Christian doesn't necessarily entail that you are a politically progressive Christianity, although every politically progressive Christian that I know is also theologically progressive. So it's very important to keep that dynamic in mind. But as we've gotten closer and closer to the election, the thing that was like really cool when I first joined Twitter in 2022 about the progressive Christians is that, yeah, they were critical of Donald Trump, but a lot of them were at least concerned about the military. Like a little bit, like not a lot. They're not like against the military. I don't know any progressive Christian that is like a hardcore, maybe there's like one or two that I've interacted with that are hardcore, consistent, philosophically anti-war. But most of them are not. Most of them supported the war in Ukraine, and most of them are willing to turn a blind eye to what's going on in Israel right now because they'd rather their candidate win. So there are two progressive Christians that I follow on Twitter, and I follow a lot of these people because I am interested in their worldview and I want some intellectual diversity on my timeline, and I really genuinely want to understand how these people think. So there are two progressive Christians that I follow on Twitter that I think have both had really bad takes about their preferred political candidate, which is Kamala Harris, during the course of this election cycle. And I think that even though it's a very small sample size, it's representative of where most American progressive Christians are at on all of these issues. And I think that it represents just how unprincipled these people are when it comes to the way that policies impact people in the real world, especially on war. I also want to make the point that I've invited several progressive Christians on my show, including the one that I'm about to talk about, and not a single one of them have returned my emails or my request. I've been turned down explicitly by a couple of them, but none of them have returned my emails and my requests. And what's wild about this is that I have like socialists and communists and atheists and Catholics and all kinds of people that like are philosophically opposed to the title of my show on my program. And we always have really great conversations. I just want a progressive Christian on there so that they can explain to my audience why they think the way that they think, but none of them are willing to do that, probably because progressive Christians don't like free speech and they don't actually have any real political principles. But that's a question for another day. So the first one that I want to talk about real quick, as I explain to you why I just can't support Donald Trump because I don't want to be hypocritical, politically speaking, is Tim Whitaker. Tim Whitaker runs the organization New Evangelicals. They have a fairly large account on Twitter, and there's a podcast, and I've listened to some of his podcast episodes, and he's a smart guy, and I've had some positive interactions with him online. It's not been negative at all, and I was like, so this is not a personal attack on Tim Whitaker, but he had a post a couple of months back on Twitter that really struck me that I wanted to bring up here, because I think that for libertarians that support, not vote, but support for Donald Trump, they can sound like a right-wing version of Tim Whitaker and what he says here. So this post was from August 22nd, and he was quote tweeting Ben Shapiro. Now, one of the things I do like about the progressive Christians is that a lot of the times they have very good insights about the hypocrisy and the double standards of conservative influencers like Ben Shapiro, who also have no principles. And so Ben Shapiro's original tweet was, Bill Clinton will be speaking tonight to a party that now despises everything he stood for. His presidency was about positional moderation about a third way. The Democratic Party is now a hard left party that despises moderation. Okay, so this was Ben Shapiro's original quote tweet. Now, Tim Whitaker was at the DNC. I was kind of following him because he was posting a lot of stuff from the DNC, taking a lot of pictures, updates, and things like that. And here's what he said on August 22nd in a quote tweet of Ben Shapiro. He says, I've been at the DNC every day and literally have yet to hear these hard left positions from the platform. The hard left is outside protesting the DNC for its complicity in the Palestinian genocide that is being funded by U.S. tax dollars, period, end of tweet. Now, There's nothing inherently objectionable about that tweet on the surface of it. Yes, there were a lot of hardcore leftists that were protesting the DNC because their administration is responsible for the genocide against the Palestinians that is being funded by our U.S. tax dollars. Here's the double standard. Tim Whitaker is a Kamala Harris supporter, and it's her administration that is funding the Palestinian genocide. Remember how I said before that as a Christian, I cannot vote for a war criminal? And I think that Donald Trump is a war criminal for reasons that I'm going to explain here in just a second. But these progressive Christians, they don't have a problem supporting a war criminal as long as they can get Trump out of office. My question for Tim, and I would love to talk to him about this. I did invite him to my show. I DM'd him on Twitter, and then he gave me his email address, and I sent him an email. Never heard back from him before. I'd still be happy to have him on, and I'd love to talk to him about this to get his perspective on it. But if I was in his position, if I was a Republican, if I was a member of the Republican Party, I would still have my libertarian principles. If I was a member of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was responsible for the Palestinian genocide, let's say Trump had won and he had continued to give money to Israel just like the Biden administration, which most likely would have happened, I would be outside with the protesters protesting the RNC. Because when real human beings are dying because of my taxpayer dollars, I can't support that as a Christian. So it's wild to me that Tim Whitaker can sit inside the DNC and talk about how the DNC, almost brag about how the DNC is not hard left, but to not be outside trying to protest the DNC and get them to change their position on Israel. Like, how is that philosophically consistent? Like, if Tim Whitaker really believed in the principles that he said he espouses, maybe he does. Maybe he just got this one wrong. But if Tim Whitaker really believed in these principles and he really believed in justice, then he would have been outside with the protesters protesting the DNC, not sitting on the inside. He would have been outside with those hard left protesters. And it is the hard left are the only ones that have any real principles these days. These are the only ones that are actively willing to stand up against the Biden administration. And again, Kamala Harris is responsible. Her administration is responsible for what is happening to the Palestinians right now. And any Christian that thinks that they can morally justify supporting Kamala Harris because they think Donald Trump is this great evil is just being a hypocrite. It's that simple. It's really that simple. You can't say that you stand up for justice and that you believe in peace and that you want to help the marginalized and the oppressed if you are willing to not just vote for, but actively support a candidate who is literally murdering those people with other people's money. That's wild to me. I just don't understand the cognitive dissonance there. And that's exactly the reason why I cannot vote for Donald Trump. I believe that Donald Trump is a war criminal, and I believe he's a socialist. I'm going to make that case here in just a second. I know I've said it before, but I just cannot vote as a Christian in good conscience for someone that has been complicit in the murder of innocent people and not apologized for it and not tried to find an off-ramp. And every single progressive Christian that I interact with, except for maybe one or two, have all been willing to look the other way when it comes to the Biden and Harris administration's terrible war crimes against innocent people in the Middle East. It's just awful. It's just like all of those progressives that think that Barack Obama was the greatest person to ever live. He got a Nobel Peace Prize. 1 million people at least died because of Barack Obama's murderous foreign policy. Barack Obama illegally invaded 5 countries, drone bombed innocent women and children, people that he knew were not connected to any terrorist groups. He did that, and yet the progressives looked the other way. You know, his only real controversy was a tan suit. It's just crazy to me. The other one is a guy here. I'm getting out my phone because I can look up the pictures of this because I screenshotted it. It's a guy named Joash Thomas, I think, is the guy's name. And I've interacted with him a couple of times on Twitter here, and we have the I have the exchange, the back and forth here, and I'm trying to figure out which one came first. Let's see here. Okay, I think I got it here. So again, I don't want to make this like a personal attack on him. I just think that this is what politics does to people. I think that Joash has some genuine, like all progressives, I think that they have a genuine desire for justice, but that genuine desire for justice is often overshadowed by the quest for political power. And because they hate conservatives so much and believe that progressivism is the way of the future, they overlook a lot of the flaws in their own campaign candidates. So I forget what he posted, but I posted something about how he posted something about the election, and I posted something about how, like, you know, it's not going to change anything at all. Just trying to have a respectful conversation with him. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I'm not aggressive on Twitter. One, I don't have time to debate a bunch of random people on Twitter, and every time you try to have like an honest back and forth with somebody, they either screech and run away or mischaracterize your perspective, and then, like, you know, all of their followers that don't know anything give you a bunch of poorly worded responses that have nothing to do with the actual point you were trying to make. So I don't remember what he said, but I just made a point that, like, I don't think that anything's going to change regardless of the election. And he responded to me, and he said, all the both Biden and Trump are horrible folks now have a true, better alternative, referring to Kamala Harris, forgetting or ignoring, I guess, conveniently, that Kamala Harris is Joe Biden's vice president and responsible for the current policy regime in Washington. But then he said, we'll see if they were serious about that concern. And I responded to him, again, a positive exchange. Like every president in our lifetime, Harris will continue to commit horrendous war crimes against innocent people overseas in the name of the American empire. Nothing changes in November. And then Joe Ash had a very pleasant response. I fear that you are correct, because at the end of the day, it's still the American empire. And I said, it's true. That's why it doesn't really matter who's on which ticket. The war machine continues on unabated. It's tragic to see it played out this way every time. Then we went on to the next conversation here. He said, it's a choice between two evils, but I still think there's a better choice among the two. So again, he's willing to say that he's making a choice between the two evils, not necessarily letting Kamala Harris off the hook, but he does seem to think that she's superior by a wide margin to Donald Trump. And I said, I understand the logic, but I still think that a choice between the two evils is choosing evil. Don't know if you're familiar with Chase for Liberty, but I actually think he might represent your philosophy better than the DNC, which is absolutely correct, at least when it comes to war. And then I responded, and even if that's not your thing, I still think not voting is better than voting for someone who supports policies I don't agree with. And then he responded, there's no way I can get behind a libertarian. To me, sorry, my phone's being weird. To me, the economic principles that are all right. To me, the economic principles of that are even more evil than the current U.S. empire, because we have a libertarian economic system in the United States that's $35 trillion. I don't understand. But this just goes to show you that people don't understand basic economics, and they've never read any libertarian political philosophy. I mean, I can't even really fault him for that. It's just frustrating that he would say that libertarianism is more evil than the current U.S. empire, when the current U.S. empire is being run by the person that he's voting for in November. I don't get that. But again, these progressive Christians don't read economics, and they don't understand what's going on here. So then he said, so then I asked him, I was like, how can you justify voting for that? And I said, I justify voting for it because of the grace of God is bigger than my worst mistakes, both intentional and unintentional, and because it's still better than voting for the hyper-capitalistic and individual policies of empire that libertarian represents. Smiley face rolling around on the ground, which is kind of condescending, which I don't do that in public, except I guess now. But it's just very interesting, because I don't think that he even understands that libertarianism, which is a philosophy about the respect of all people's property rights, is fundamentally incompatible with empire, and that his giant progressive nation is literally how we get to empire. It's very interesting. Empire is literally funded through tax. Hey, this is my response. Empire is literally funded through taxation and the confiscation of wealth from peaceful, voluntary economic exchanges. And no matter how gracious God is, I still don't think he's in favor of bombing innocent Palestinian babies, and probably doesn't want us condoning it. Yes, his response, yes, empire is funded that way, but we're also commanded to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, our taxes, and give to God what belongs to him, all of ourselves. I try to live this out as faithfully as I can, and that's how I sleep at night. So that's a very interesting exchange. I do wonder how he would handle the passages on slavery in the New Testament, where those that are slaves or commanded to be obedient to their owners. I don't know what he would say about that. I mean, we are commanded to, if you are a slave, be obedient to our slave owners. It's very interesting. But that entire exchange just demonstrates, hopefully, to those of you guys that are listening, how double-minded some of these progressive Christians are. And I think it's very unprincipled. To say on the one hand that you believe in justice, and then on the other hand support a candidate that you believe to be a war criminal. Now, I know that he doesn't actually believe that Kamala Harris is a war criminal, and I don't think most of these progressives do, because they don't actually think about war from a philosophical and a moral perspective. It's like what Lori Calhoun says. For most Americans, war is something that we watch on TV. It's like a television show. It's just a part of the news. It's not real to us because we don't have to experience it. But as a Christian, I have empathy for the people, many of whom are my brothers and sisters in Christ, that are dying overseas because of my tax dollars and because of the policies of the American empire that are supported by progressives that have the exact same social, economic, and political beliefs as Joe Ash Thomas does. So I just cannot get behind Donald Trump. And for me, again, being in a state that is not a swing state, I'm not supporting Trump. I'm not voting for him. That way I can at least say that I have been completely morally consistent, unlike the progressive Christians that are willing to sell out all of their values in this quest for political power, which is really what this all comes down to. Okay, so we are 30 minutes into the show, and I've explained why I can't vote for them. I also want to say ahead of time, too, that I know that there are a lot of people that are frustrated with Chase Oliver. Again, it's Tuesday, October the 1st. Tonight, I'm going to be doing an LCI Green Room with Chase Oliver and with Jacob Winograd, where we are going to work through some of the problems between the Mises wing of the Libertarian Party and the Oliver wing of the Libertarian Party. And I hope that is going to shed a lot of light on this conversation. I do plan in the next couple of days on throwing that conversation up on my RSS feed for the podcast. So if you didn't get a chance to catch it a couple weeks ago, just give it a couple of days and it'll be up there. I can also tell you right now that the episode I did with Dave Casey will be coming out on Tuesday. So you'll be able to hear Dave Casey's case for Trump, and then you'll be able to hear our conversation with Chase Oliver. All of that stuff is going to be really helpful, I think, for people that are trying to think through this. But I actually do want to talk about the economic and military reasons why I cannot support Donald Trump, because I know that I've made the claim that Donald Trump is a socialist and that he's a war criminal. There are a lot of libertarians, even libertarians that are voting for him, that would acknowledge that. And I just want to explain why I believe that that is the case. So in terms of economics, the greatest critique of Trumponomics comes from David Stockman. Now, David Stockman is a really great libertarian-ish writer. He was the budget director or maybe the secretary of the Treasury under Ronald Reagan, and I think sometimes went to war against the Reagan administration in terms of spending. He's a very smart guy, and he wrote a book that came out earlier this year called Trump's War on Capitalism that was actually forwarded by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So it's a really interesting combination of characters there. And in this book, Trump's War on Capitalism, he talks about all of the economic problems that Donald Trump initiated during his time in office, or maybe not initiated, but continued from his predecessors. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't read this book yet and you're considering voting for Trump, or if you know you're going to vote for Trump and you just want to be more informed about Trump's deficiencies, you should definitely get a copy of this book and read it as quickly as possible, because it is a very well-researched book that's based on hard statistics and hard evidence. So David Stockman brings the receipts in his critique of Donald Trump's economic policies. And you cannot escape as a libertarian, if you are an adherent to the Austrian tradition, you cannot escape the conclusion that Donald Trump is a wild socialist. You can't. David Stockman is going to argue convincingly, not argue convincingly, but show empirically that under the Trump administration, the debt was raised. The federal debt continued to rise unabated under Donald Trump's administration. Our spending deficit continued to grow. Trump actually increased military spending. There are a lot of people that say that Trump was a dove, and yes, we have to give him credit for not getting us involved in another pointless war in the Middle East, but he didn't actually do anything to undo any of those wars, and he increased military spending, and his economic policies led to greater inequality, that the wealthiest Americans that actually control the mechanisms of the economy became more wealthy, and the average Americans actually became less wealthy. Now, again, it's very, very important to remember that in 2008, in response to the housing crisis, Ben Bernanke and the Federal Reserve launched a policy that has really not changed up until this day of keeping interest rates artificially low, close to zero, and regularly printing money, what we call quantitative easing, which they do through the Federal Open Market Committee, these open market operations. They have these financial tools that they use to increase the money supply. And as every good Austrian knows, whenever the money supply is increased, it lowers the value of the money. The people that receive the newly created money are able to buy goods and services at pre-inflationary prices. Again, for an Austrian, inflation is not the increase in prices. It is the increase in the supply of money that results in higher prices. And this almost always makes the wealthiest and well-connected people better off, and those that are just saving and trying to get by through working worse off. And inequality increased under Donald Trump. In fact, the interest rates have been artificially low since the creation of the Federal Reserve. I don't think that we need to have a government organization that regulates interest rates at all. I think interest rates should be determined by the market, like prices and every other single market mechanism. But Jerome Powell did not have interest rates low enough for Donald Trump. And at one point, I believe in 2018 or 2019, Donald Trump berated Jerome Powell for not lowering interest rates even more. So that shows that Donald Trump doesn't even understand the basic principles of monetary theory. Now, there are a lot of people that say, well, Trump cut taxes. Okay, it's great that Trump cut taxes. And that did have a very short-term positive impact on some American businesses. But it was not offset by spending. You cannot decrease the amount of money that you have coming into the Treasury and not also at the same time increase the amount of money that you are spending without increasing the deficit. And this is what the Trump economic apologists will always say. Well, Trump gave us the tax cuts. It does not matter. That was it's what they call a tissue fire. That's something that benefited certain companies in the short run. But if the federal deficit is not dealt with because we've offset spending, then it's not going to create long-term economic growth. It's just not possible. And so, yes, Donald Trump cut taxes, but his administration did not cut spending, and that was a problem. We also have the problem of Donald Trump imposing socialist tariffs on foreign countries like China. This is a really big problem for free market economics. We know that tariffs always hurt domestic consumers. The price increases, the price increases of the tariffs, especially on capital goods, will be absorbed by the companies that use those capital goods to produce other commercial consumer goods and services. But this will always result in higher prices for the American consumer. So Trump's tariff regime, which has not really been undone by the Biden administration, by the way, is just showing once again that these economic policies continue from administration to administration without ever being structurally reformed, would have hurt the American economy in the long run. Because it turns out that fighting economic wars with other countries always wind up hurting domestic consumers. And Donald Trump was guilty of that because he doesn't understand basic economics. There are some people that say that Donald Trump learned his lesson. I don't believe that he did. We also have to talk about COVID. COVID was a big part of this. COVID really launched the $6 trillion money printing binge that the Federal Reserve went on. But it was Trump's policies throughout 2020 that made the economic crisis that resulted from COVID even worse than it would have otherwise been. On economics, Trump was terrible. Now, was he par for the course? Yeah, pretty much. Was he better or worse than Barack Obama? No. Was he better or worse than George Bush? No, not really. And had 2020 not happened and COVID never taken effect, at the end of Trump's term, we would still be faced with a federal bubble and an economy that's completely controlled and regulated by the government in the interest of the wealthiest and most powerful people in our society. And Donald Trump did nothing to stop that from happening. And for the people that say that he learned his lesson, he has considered Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, an insider of insiders, for Treasury Secretary. Donald Trump says he wants to drain the swamp and that he wants to be an outsider, but he wants to bring in people like Jamie Dimon, who is it's like an insider of insiders, a hardcore economic manager, to be the Treasury Secretary in his new administration. Donald Trump has not learned his lesson. I cannot vote for a socialist. Donald Trump is a socialist. That's the end of the story for me. Again, I understand why some libertarians could vote for him. I don't understand how any libertarian could support this. Maybe some libertarians believe that Trump will do better the next time around. Like I said earlier in the episode, I really, truly, sincerely hope that you are correct. But I don't believe it. The next issue we have to deal with is war. Now, yes, Trump was way better, I guess by comparison, than George W. Bush or Barack Obama, both of whom are the worst war criminals that are alive today. They should be locked up in Guantanamo Bay, but we're never going to see any of that kind of justice, unfortunately. And anyone that says that George W. Bush or Barack Obama, progressive, or progressive conservative libertarian, anyone who says that they were great presidents does not actually care about justice. They're fine overlooking the deaths of millions of people. I've talked about the Brown University's Watson Institute's Cost of War project on the show before. I really do think that you guys need to go check that out to contextualize just how damaging the war on terror was. They've actually quantified the numbers of the war on terror. Nearly 1 million people in the Middle East have been killed by U.S. guns and bombs since 2001. But when you calculate up the death toll that results from lack of access to hospitals, clean drinking water, electricity, other economic dislocations, famine, and things like that, the United States' war on terror, launched by George W. Bush, escalated by Barack Obama, and continued by Donald Trump, has killed nearly 4 million people in the Middle East. How any Christian could look at that and not at least be a little concerned or want to ask some follow-up questions about whether or not we should be supporting this political system is just not paying attention enough. Or maybe they're just political hacks that want political power, that don't actually have any real political principles. It's a shame. As a Christian, you just can't support the deaths of nearly 4.5 million innocent people. On top of that, over 7,000 U.S. servicemen killed in action, servicemen and women. Nearly 30,000, more than 30,000 committed suicide since coming back, and then adding $7 to $8 trillion to the U.S. deficit. It's just not worth it. It's not. That's the war on terror. Yes, Donald Trump did not get us involved in any more wars, but he didn't do anything to stop them. Remember that Donald Trump escalated drone strikes in Afghanistan. There were many, many innocent people who died because of Donald Trump's drone campaign in Afghanistan. And yes, we know that George W. Bush started using drones towards the end of his presidency, and Barack Obama became an absolute mastermind at using drones to bomb babies and other people who weren't actually responsible for 9/11. But Donald Trump continued that. Drone strikes actually increased in Afghanistan when he became the president. We also have the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iranian defense minister. He was inside Iraqi territory, but this was a clear and direct provocation towards Iran. We have no business getting ourselves into a war with Iran. He continued to remain hostile towards Iran throughout his entire administration. We know that the Western hostility towards Iran is mostly manufactured. It gives us an enemy that justifies our military presence in the Middle East. But there have been a lot of people that have died and a lot of money that has been wasted trying to become more hostile towards Iran, rather. It's not good. We didn't actually end any wars. That's the problem. Yes, towards the end, he talked about withdrawing from Afghanistan, but he didn't actually do it. And sure, he was being he was being lied to by people that were in his own administration. Okay, but he should have known better. If Trump was great, he should have known better. We also have to deal with the fact that the United States, under Barack Obama, has been supporting what is literally a genocide in Yemen, backing Saudi Arabia since 2015. This was Barack Obama's big concession to the Saudi Arabian government after he made the nuclear arms deal with Iran in 2015. The Saudis were very upset with that because Iran is their regional competitor. And so Barack Obama, in order to get in the good graces of the Saudi Arabians, decided that he was going to give them money and military support to launch this brutal war against the people in Yemen, in which hundreds of thousands of innocent people have died. Now, in 2019, there was a war powers resolution on Yemen that was passed through both chambers of the House and delivered to Donald Trump's desk. What this war powers resolution would have done essentially is say that all U.S. military support for the war in Yemen would have to end in 60 or 90 days if Congress didn't actually vote on it and declare war in Yemen. So it was a very, very easy off-ramp for the United States escalation of the conflict in Yemen that was being waged by the Saudi government and funded by the United States of America. Open and shut case. Slam dunk politically for Donald Trump. Both parties agreed on it, passed through both chambers of the House as he could have signed it, and we could have ended that part of the war. And going into an election year, he could have been able to go to his constituents and say, look, I'm trying to end these wars. And he vetoed it. It would have saved us a lot of money. It would have saved countless lives. And Donald Trump vetoed a deal that would have forced Congress to actually vote on giving military aid to Saudi Arabia for the war in Yemen. unacceptable. That's what a war criminal does. Donald Trump is also partly responsible for the war in Ukraine. Initially, he had some really great instincts, going to the president of North Korea, going to the president of Russia, trying to build bridges with them. But the media lied. They did lie about Donald Trump being a Russian asset and having connections to the Russian government. But Donald Trump had to get tough with Russia unnecessarily. Instead of trying to fight for peace, Donald Trump had to look tough against the Russians. So he sold arms to Ukraine, lethal arms to Ukraine, early in his administration. And he unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that was signed by the United States with Russia in the 1980s, which meant that the United States could put missiles that could go deep into Russian territory very close to Russia's borders. It's not good. Trump is responsible for what is happening in Ukraine right now, not as much as the Biden administration is. And maybe Trump is sincere about wanting to find a peaceful way out of that conflict. But his administration continued to provoke the Russians, and that ultimately led to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. He did make great overtures. He referenced the military-industrial complex. He talked to the right people, but he got pressured by his own deep state. And he picked people like John Bolton and Rex Tillerson and James Mattis, just terrible neocons, to be in his cabinet and to be advisors for him. And of course, he's awful on Israel. So yeah, in the last presidential debate with Kamala Harris, he said some really great things about ending the war in Ukraine. I don't think that our Israel policy is going to change at all if Donald Trump becomes president. I don't. I think we're going to get more wars, and I think it's going to be just as bad as it was before. And of course, the biggest problem that I have with Donald Trump, besides the fact that he's a socialist and a war criminal, is that he is responsible for the government's botched response to COVID. He is the father of the lockdowns. He kept Anthony Fauci in power the entire time that he was in office. He is the one who is responsible for Operation Warp Speed. Now, I know that there are a lot of people out there that love the vaccines, but man, they sure did make some of the most evil pharmaceutical companies in the world billions of dollars. And it does seem like people are now starting to have some very, very detrimental side effects after taking these vaccines. And we weren't allowed to question them, and we were censored on YouTube, and we were censored in the mainstream media, and we were locked in our houses, and people lost their jobs, and it destroyed the U.S. economy, and people hate each other more than they ever did before. And Donald Trump could have done something to stop that, but he didn't. Donald Trump was absolutely awful on COVID, and his record on COVID is inexcusable, and he hasn't really done anything to meaningfully apologize for that. He's blamed other people, but do you really think that if Donald Trump becomes president, that we're going to prosecute Anthony Fauci? I mean, that dude needs to be thrown in prison. He really does. For contempt for Congress. Of course, I have contempt for Congress too, but they've never called me up to Congress. I've never lied to Congress like Anthony Fauci has. He deserves to be thrown in prison. Will there be COVID justice under Donald Trump? No, because Donald Trump is the architect of the COVID tyranny. And that's pretty much the end of the story there. Again, I know that this was a lot of negative information about Donald Trump, but when I think about the reasons why, not only can I not support him, but why I can't vote for him, it is these things that make it impossible for me as a libertarian and as a Christian to support Donald Trump. I want to be consistent. I don't want to be like the progressive Christians. I don't want to be like the Republicans that are ride or die Trump that don't have any real political philosophy. I mean, one of the greatest problems facing our country right now, and again, as a Christian, I don't even care about America. America is another empire that will eventually be consigned to the dustbin of history like all of the other empires. In the end, God is going to bring about the new heavens and the new earth, and Christ will rule over all. And I believe that's already happening. It's already been inaugurated now. So I don't really care about the future of America, except for the fact that I don't want people to suffer unnecessarily. And I think that we do genuinely have a shot after the Enlightenment to build a free society. And I think that we understand the best principles. But as a libertarian and a Christian, I just can't support Donald Trump. And as I was saying, I think the biggest problem that's facing our society right now is a complete lack of basic political philosophy and basic economic knowledge, and then a complete inability to try to be principled and consistent in the way that they think about politics. And that's what I'm trying to do right now. This is not an attack on Donald Trump in particular, so much as it is an indictment of the entire American political system. And that's basically my argument today, guys. I know I've been going on for a long time, and there were probably parts of that episode that sounded a little bit ranty. But we're just a couple of weeks out from the election, and I really did want to give my thoughts on Donald Trump. Hopefully this was helpful to those of you that are trying to think through what you're going to be doing on election day. If you do feel convicted that you have an obligation to vote for Donald Trump, then that's fine. Just please don't become a Trump supporter, and please be willing to criticize him and admit that you were wrong if he winds up doing exactly what he did the first time that he was president. Like I said before, I'll be the first person to get on anyone's podcast and admit that I was wrong and sing the praises of Donald Trump if he somehow gets this right and manages to roll back the state. But I just don't think it's going to happen. Couple last things before we get out of here today. Thank you guys again so much for hanging on to this. We have a lot of great merch for the show over at libertarianchristians.com. You should go over and check that out. libertarianchristians.com/either shop or store. I think either of those will take you there. You can get a highball glass for my show. You can get a mug, a coaster. We're always working on getting some new merch up there. Like I said before, my discussion with Dave Casey, where he gives the reasons why he is going to support Donald Trump, will be released on Thursday. And the interview I did with Chase Oliver and Jacob Winograd on the LCI Green Room, that will also be coming out in the next couple of days on my stream, so be looking out for that if you want to think about this a little bit more. You might have noticed that I did not talk about Chase Oliver much on the show. That is because I have done that in other forums, and I wanted to specifically address why I could not support Trump as a Christian and as a libertarian on this, so this wasn't really about Chase. I'll put links in the show notes to either the conversations that I've had with other people or the shows that I've been on where I've talked about why I'm voting for Chase Oliver. Is he a perfect candidate? No, he's not. Is he kind of the Rothbardian libertarian that I would hope that we would have representing our party this time around? No, he's not. But I still think he's a great libertarian, and he's good on war, and he's good on the Fed, and those are the things that really matter to me. So you can go and check out my thoughts on Chase on another show, and why I'm voting for him, even if you don't feel like as a libertarian you can support him. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to the end of this episode. Everything that you guys do, I really appreciate. If it wasn't for the people that listen to the show every week, it would be a complete waste of time to do it, and you have made it possible for me to meet so many incredible people and have so many incredible experiences, and it's just, I'm very thankful that you listen to me talk week in and week out. You guys are seriously the best. I'm really thankful for everything that you do, and I'm really excited to see what happens over the next couple weeks or months. Well, maybe excited is not the right word. I don't think any of us are actually excited for it. I'm very interested to see what's going to happen over the next couple weeks or months, and there's no other group of people that I want to do this with besides my friends and family than you, my great listeners of the show. So thank you guys for everything that you've done, and I will see you all next Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.